The 50 most famous Christmas artworks. Number 50. The Nativity. Matthias Grunewald. Between 1512 and 1516. Painted between 1512 and 1516, Matthias Grunewald's The Nativity is one of the scenes that the artist depicted with emotional intensity and unique expressiveness in the context of the Eisenheim altarpiece. This work combines the fervent spirituality of the late Gothic period with chromatic and light experimentation that anticipates the sensitivity of the Renaissance. In it, the Virgin, Saint Joseph and the Child appear surrounded by a supernatural atmosphere, where the light seems to emanate from the newborn himself, framing the profound devotion of the moment. Grunewald is characterized by an unusual drama for his time, reflecting the crudeness and humanity of the religious experience. In this nativity, the attention to detail is outstanding. The texture of the fabrics, the restrained expressions on the faces and the presence of the angels, painted with an almost ethereal delicacy, contribute to a balanced composition but charged with mysticism. The subtlety of the color nuances and the precision of the forms demonstrate the artist's technical expertise. In a period when artistic rules were in transition, Grunewald's work combines late medieval elements with echoes of the Renaissance, while retaining an emotional force of its own. This nativity not only reveals the sacred moment of Christ's birth, but also exposes the intimate relationship between the divine and the earthly, overcoming the visual conventions of his time. Number 49. The Adoration of the Shepherds. Orazio Gentileschi, 1610s. Orazio Gentileschi, one of the key artists of the Italian Baroque, captures in The Adoration of the Shepherds an intimate and serene scene of the birth of Christ. Painted in the 1610s, the work reflects the influence of Caravaggio's chiaroscuro, with lighting that highlights the main figures and creates an atmosphere full of contemplation. The Madonna and Child appear in a dark space, illuminated by a soft, warm light that gives the scene a contemplative atmosphere. Unlike other, more monumental representations, Gentileschi opts for a close and human approach. The shepherds, humble and shocked, bow before the child with sincere reverence, without artifice or pomp. The composition emphasizes the simplicity and emotional truth of the story, with gestures and expressions that convey devotion and wonder at the miracle of divine birth. The brushwork is meticulous and the chromatic tones subtle, achieving a balance between realism and a sense of the sacred. Gentileschi establishes an immediate connection with the viewer, who becomes a silent witness to a domestic scene, but one charged with transcendence. This adoration does not aim to dazzle with opulence, but to move with its sincerity and human warmth. Number 48. The Adoration of the Shepherds. Guido Reni. Circa 1640. The Adoration of the Shepherds, by Guido Reni, painted around 1640, represents the ideal synthesis between classicist elegance and the religious fervor of the Baroque. In the composition, the Holy Family is shown with an almost sculptural delicacy, surrounded by shepherds who contemplate the child with respect and admiration. Reni dispenses with excessive ornamentation and focuses attention on the serene beauty of the figures and the harmony of the whole. Guido Reni, known for his refined technique and his taste for balanced composition, uses a clear and luminous color palette. The softly modeled faces convey contained emotions, and the masterfully drawn hands express devotion and tenderness without the need for exaggerated gestures. The carefully directed light enhances the calm of the moment and highlights the purity of the child Jesus as the spiritual epicenter. The classicist atmosphere surrounding the scene does not detract from the emotional depth of the work. On the contrary, It endows it with a nobility and solemnity that reflect the grandeur of the event. The absence of ornate backgrounds and the simplicity of the setting allow the interaction between the characters to gain relevance, emphasizing the human and divine dimension of Christ's birth. Number 47. The Adoration of the Magi. Domenico Veneziano, 1440s. Created in the 1440s, Domenico Veneziano's The Adoration of the Magi is a work that belongs to the early Italian Renaissance, a period in which new techniques of linear perspective, clear coloring, and the realistic representation of space were consolidated in art. In this scene, the Holy Family, the three wise men, and their companions are arranged in a bright setting, with harmonious architecture and a serene landscape that suggests the influence of the Florentine atmosphere. Veneziano stands out for his use of soft, pastel colors, which give the composition a luminosity unusual for his time. The light, nuanced and uniform, unites figures and background, creating a feeling of balance and calm. This painter, a precursor of perspective and the scientific treatment of space, places the figures in a coherent manner, achieving a believable scene in which the divinity of the event coexists with the naturalness of human expressions. For Veneziano, the Adoration of the Magi is an opportunity to show his mastery in the representation of the human figure and the landscape, fusing traditional iconography with the new intellectual concerns of his time. The work is part of the transition from late Gothic to the full Renaissance, where forms become more corporeal and light takes on a structuring role. Number 46. The Adoration of the Magi. Hans Memling, circa 1479 to 1480. Hans Memling's The Adoration of the Magi, painted between 1479 and 1480, displays the hallmarks of 15th century Flemish painting: meticulous detail, rich, vibrant coloring, and meticulous care in the depiction of fabrics and objects. In this scene, the Holy Family is surrounded by the Magi and their entourage, displaying a range of faces, clothing, and gifts, each treated with almost miniaturist precision. The clear, diffused light, typical of Nordic art, gives the whole a serene and gentle atmosphere, accentuating the stillness of the sacred moment. The faces, captured with realism and delicacy, reflect humility and wonder before the child. The landscape, visible through the architecture, integrates the biblical scene into an almost everyday setting, enhancing the emotional closeness of the event. Influenced by Jan van Eyck and Rogier van der Weyden, Memling demonstrates in this work his mastery of the oil technique, which allows for a smooth and detailed gradation of tones. The composition carefully balances each element, achieving a harmonious and serene whole in which divinity is expressed through beauty and visual order. Number 45. The Adoration of the Magi. Jan Gossaert, Mabuse. Between 1510 and 1515. Between 1510 and 1515, Jan Gossaert, also known as Mabuse, painted The Adoration of the Magi, combining Flemish tradition with the influence of the Italian Renaissance. This synthesis can be seen in the monumentality of the figures, the meticulous detail, and the inclusion of architectural motifs inspired by classical antiquity. The biblical scene is set in a palatial setting, with columns and arches evoking an atmosphere of grandeur and refinement. In contrast to the sumptuousness of the background, the main characters display a serene piety. The Magi, elegantly dressed, offer their gifts to the child Jesus, while Mary and Joseph calmly contemplate the miracle. The use of oil on panel allows Gossaert to achieve a dense and rich coloring, highlighting both the quality of the clothing and the expressiveness of the faces. The composition is balanced between the luxury of the details and the spiritual relevance of the event. Gossaert integrates Italian influences in the representation of the human body, giving greater volume and naturalism to the figures, without losing the introspective character of Flemish art. This combination makes his work a bridge between two artistic traditions. Number 44. The Adoration of the Magi. Lorenzo Monaco. Between the years 1420 and 1422. Painted between 1420 and 1422, Lorenzo Monaco's The Adoration of the Magi is an outstanding example of the transitional period between the late Gothic style and the early Renaissance in Florence. Monaco, trained in the Trecento painting tradition, uses gold backgrounds, stylized lines and bright colors, giving the scene a mystical and spiritual atmosphere. The Holy Family is presented with idealized grace, while the Magi, dressed in sumptuous clothing, bow before the child. The gold in the background highlights the silhouettes and expressions, imprinting a sense of sacredness that envelops all the figures. The composition maintains the verticality and elegance typical of the Gothic, although with an incipient interest in volume and spatiality. Lorenzo Monaco combines the Byzantine tradition of using gold leaf with a more human and emotional sensitivity. Despite the inherited formal rigidity, the painter begins to suggest greater naturalism in gestures and attitudes, preparing the way for the advances of the Quattrocento. Thus, the work becomes a testimony to the change in artistic mentality towards a more tangible representation of the divine world. Number 43. The Adoration of the Magi. Andrea del Sarto, 1511. In The Adoration of the Magi, painted in 1511, Andrea del Sarto shows the maturity of his style, characterized by soft brushstrokes, balanced compositions, and an exquisite sense of color. This scene, typical of the Renaissance repertoire, presents the Holy Family flanked by the Magi and their companions, arranged in a harmonious and fluid composition. Del Sarto, a prominent Florentine painter, resorts to clear modeling of the figures and a delicate use of halftones, achieving subtle chromatic transitions that give the painting a captivating visual unity. The serene and luminous atmosphere highlights the humanity of the scene without losing its spiritual dimension, elegantly balancing devotion and proximity between the characters. The fusion between realism in the figures and refinement in technical execution makes this work an example of the high level achieved by the Florentine Renaissance. Andrea del Sarto, trained in the rich artistic environment of the time, was influenced by earlier masters such as Fra Bartolomeo and Leonardo, while developing his own personality distinguished by compositional balance and delicate lines. Number 42. The Annunciation. Jacopo Pontormo. Between 1527 and 1528. The Annunciation, by Jacopo Pontormo, painted between 1527 and 1528, is a representative example of Florentine mannerism, a period after the High Renaissance marked by unstable compositions, vivid colors, and stylized figures. In this work, the moment when the angel Gabriel announces to the Virgin Mary the divine conception is presented with a strong emotional charge and a dynamic composition. Pontormo breaks with Renaissance serenity, opting for a less defined space, where the figures seem to float in an ethereal environment. The chromatic scale, with acid and contrasting tones, contributes to the disturbing and mystical atmosphere. The artist lengthens the bodies, alters the proportions, and plays with unusual poses, reinforcing the emotional tension of the sacred moment. The uniqueness of this Annunciation lies in its ability to convey the bewilderment and wonder of the divine event. Mary, surprised, seems to withdraw into herself before the heavenly presence, while the angel bursts in with ethereal lightness. The painting reflects the mannerist sensibility, less concerned with the verisimilitude of space and more interested in expressing internal sensations. Number 41. The Nativity. Domenico Beccafumi, 1540s. In the 1540s, Domenico Beccafumi, a Sienese painter with a mannerist bent, approaches the theme of the Nativity with a personal and poetic approach. The scene of Christ's birth unfolds in a dim environment interrupted by flashes of light that seem to emanate from the child, a resource that intensifies the sacred sense of the event. The free and expressive coloring and brushstrokes reveal a sensibility that moves away from the classical order. Beccafumi experiments with unreal tones, shades, and blurred contours, creating an enveloping, almost dreamlike atmosphere. The figures, slender and somewhat elongated, display delicate gestures that reinforce the atmosphere of intimacy and contemplation. The Virgin and Saint Joseph contemplate the child with a mixture of tenderness and wonder, while the carefully distributed light enhances the mystical character of the event. This nativity is distinguished by the creative freedom with which the artist interprets the biblical story. There is no desire for literal description, but rather the search for an emotional climate that invites contemplation. Beccafumi, aware of the new currents that were running through Italian art, explores the relationship between form, color, and spirituality, generating a subtle and suggestive work. Number 40. The Nativity. Vittore Carpaccio, 1504. In 1504, Vittore Carpaccio, a master of the Venetian school, painted the Nativity with the narrative sensitivity and scenographic sense that characterize his work. The scene takes place in a soft landscape, bathed in a golden light that recalls the lagoon atmosphere of Venice. The child, the Virgin, and Saint Joseph are surrounded by peaceful nature, with minute details that suggest an attentive observation of the real world. Carpaccio uses a warm and harmonious color palette, which integrates the figures into the environment without stridency. The folds of the clothing, the vegetation, and the architecture suggested in the background reflect the artist's skill in handling perspective and detailed description. Although the scene is deeply devotional, it retains a narrative and intimate air, as if it were an everyday passage observed with reverent eyes. The symbiosis between the human and the divine is achieved without dramatic tensions, highlighting the placidity of the sacred moment. Carpaccio thus offers a calm vision of the Nativity, far removed from the apparent magnificence of other painters, but equally effective in its ability to convey veneration. This painting is, in short, a reflection of the subtlety and balance that the Venetian tradition was able to achieve, fusing spirituality, sensitivity, and observation of everyday life. Number 39. The Adoration of the Shepherds. Giuseppe de Ribera, 1650s. In the work, The Adoration of the Shepherds, painted by Giuseppe de Ribera during the 1650s, the tenebrous style so characteristic of the Neapolitan school in which the painter developed most of his career can be appreciated. Ribera, born in Spain but settled in Italy, was nourished by Caravagesque realism, depicting religious scenes with a palpable crudeness and humanity. In this painting, the birth of Christ is represented in a close and austere way, without the pomp that often characterizes the subject, focusing on the emotion that emanates from the figures. The shepherds, humble and with features marked by daily life, bow before the child with sincere gestures. The light, coming from the infant himself, is dim and filters through the shadows, carefully outlining the contours of the characters. Ribera avoids excessive idealizations and concentrates on the realism of the fabrics, the tanned hands and the pensive faces, giving the scene an intimate and reflective air. The work stands out for its chromatic sobriety and the intensity of the expressions, which combine to underline the spiritual message of the Christmas miracle. Ribera, skilled in the representation of chiaroscuro, manages to transmit the sacredness of the moment through silence and simplicity. This adoration is an example of the artist's stylistic maturity, in which faith and humanity are intertwined without superfluous additions. Number 38. The Adoration of the Shepherds. Anton Raphael Mengs, 1770. Anton Raphael Mengs, one of the main promoters of neoclassicism, addresses in his Adoration of the Shepherds, 1770, a reinterpretation of the biblical theme marked by the influence of the classical tradition and the search for a rational and harmonious aesthetic ideal. The scene, which shows the Holy Family surrounded by shepherds, abandons the previous tenebrous drama and adopts a light clarity and balanced composition, typical of the return to the classical forms of Greco-Roman art. Mengs, trained in Rome and closely linked to the postulates of the great theorist Johann Joachim Winckelmann, applies a clear and pure chromatic palette, eliminating superfluous details and focusing on the nobility of the figures. The Virgin, represented with softness in the modeling, appears serene, while Saint Joseph and the shepherds maintain gestures of contained admiration. The light, diaphanous and orderly, bathes the characters without creating violent contrasts, underlining the purity and idealized perfection of the scene. Unlike Baroque or Mannerist interpretations, Mengs seeks to convey divinity through visual order, moderation and elegance. This adoration exemplifies the transition to a more intellectualized and controlled art, in which the miracle is suggested by harmony of form and nobility of feeling, rather than by dramatic effect or compositional complexity. Number 37. The Nativity. Gerard David, circa 1490. Gerard David, a master of the Flemish school of Bruges, painted this Nativity around 1490, integrating the pictorial traditions of the late Gothic with the technical refinement of Flemish oil painting. The work presents the Holy Family with a calm realism, enveloped in an intimate and silent atmosphere. The child, placed in the center, illuminates the scene with his symbolic presence, while the Virgin and Saint Joseph contemplate the newborn with serene devotion. David uses a palette of deep and vibrant colors, which highlights the meticulousness in the representation of the fabrics, textures, and architectural details of the background. The serene atmosphere and soft light, characteristic of Northern Europe, enhance the sense of calm and contemplation. Unlike the majesty of the Italian Renaissance, Flemish painting of this period focuses on the careful observation of the natural world and the sincerity of emotions. The suggested landscape and the delicate balance between the figures provide a harmonious composition, in which spirituality is not imposed with scenic effects, but springs from everyday reality. This Nativity by Gerard David testifies to the technical mastery and poetic refinement of the Flemish school, which was able to combine precision in detail with the spiritual intensity of the Christian message. Number 36. The Adoration of the Shepherds. Matthias Stomer, 1630s. Matthias Stomer, a Flemish painter who worked much of his life in Italy, painted his Adoration of the Shepherds in the 1630s, adopting the resources of Caravagism with a personality of his own. The scene takes place in a dark, densely lit by the light emanating from the Christ child, who becomes the dramatic focus of the composition. This selective lighting marks faces and hands, highlighting gestures of surprise, humility, and veneration. Unlike more idealized interpretations, Stomer seeks a forceful realism. The shepherds are rustic men, with weathered features, and the Virgin and Saint Joseph appear as human figures full of humanity. The dark palette and sparsely detailed backgrounds focus attention on the emotional interaction between the characters and the divine newborn. Stomer's technique, with firm brushstrokes and marked contrasts, creates an atmosphere of silent tension in which the modest crib becomes a symbolic altar. This work reveals the influence of Caravaggio and the tenebrists, as well as the author's desire to express the emotional dimension of the episode, making the Adoration a moving and close encounter. Number 35. The Annunciation. Jan van Eyck. Nearby between 1434 and 1436. The Annunciation, attributed to Jan van Eyck, dated between 1434 and 1436, is a jewel of early Flemish art, in which technical rigor and religious symbolism are masterfully combined. The scene takes place in an exquisitely detailed architectural interior, where every element from the floor tiles to the Gothic stained glass windows is represented with extraordinary precision. The Virgin Mary, with a serene and elegant countenance, receives the message from the angel Gabriel, whose wings and richly detailed clothing demonstrate the painter's meticulousness. Van Eyck, a master of the oil technique, makes the most of the medium's capacity to achieve smooth transitions of light and color, reflections on shiny surfaces, and a palpable atmosphere. The light floods the space softly, highlighting the delicate faces and velvety surfaces of the fabrics. In addition, Marian symbols and references to ecclesiastical purity are hidden in the composition, inviting a complex devotional reading. This Annunciation transcends the mere representation of the biblical event, turning it into a contemplative experience where refined technique and attention to detail reinforce the sacred character. Van Eyck places the miracle in a context of tangible reality, proposing a spiritual dimension that is revealed in the splendor of the visible world. Number 34. The Nativity. Fra Filippo Lippi. Between 1467 and 1469. Fra Filippo Lippi, a Carmelite friar and Florentine painter, created his Nativity between 1467 and 1469, reflecting the lyrical sweetness of the Quattrocento. The composition has a classical balance, with the Holy Family in the center, surrounded by reverent angels and shepherds. Mary appears with soft and delicate features, typical of the Florentine ideal of beauty, and the child, small and intimately wrapped in cloths, radiates a serene luminosity. Lippi uses a palette of light tones, pinks and subtle blues, which evoke an ethereal atmosphere. The light, filtered and soft, caresses the contours of the figures, giving them an almost sculptural appearance. The background, suggested by hills and architecture, does not aim to faithfully reproduce nature, but to create a harmonious setting that favors the contemplation of the sacred moment. Lippi's refined and restrained technique reflects the transition to the full Renaissance, in which perspective, subtle chiaroscuro, and idealization of forms combine to exalt spirituality. This Nativity is a reflection of the serene devotion of 15th-century Florentine art, in which beauty, grace, and compositional measure exalt the Christian message. Number 33. The Journey of the Magi. Benozzo Gozzoli. Between 1459 and 1461. Benozzo Gozzoli painted The Journey of the Magi between 1459 and 1461 for the chapel of the Medici Riccardi Palace in Florence. In this fresco, the artist narrates the journey of the Magi to Bethlehem through a display of knights, landscapes, animals, and traditional details. The scene, rather than a strictly biblical representation, is a festive and sumptuous parade that reflects the grandeur of the Medici family and the pomp of 15th-century Florentine art. Gozzoli masters the fresco technique and takes great care of each figure, integrating them into an idealized landscape with gentle hills, castles, and lush vegetation. The royal entourage wears richly decorated clothing, and portraits of illustrious figures of the time are interspersed with the biblical narrative, reinforcing the propagandistic dimension of the work. The light is clear and even, emphasizing the sharpness of the details and the atmosphere of celebration. This journey of the Magi becomes a monumental tapestry of Florentine society, where devotion is interwoven with ostentation and power. Gozzoli, with his brilliant palette and narrative joy, transforms the gospel episode into a procession charged with symbolism, exalting the earthly magnificence and spiritual dimension of the event. Number 32. The Nativity, Antonello da Messina, between 1470 and 1475. Antonello da Messina, a key figure in the introduction of oil painting in Italy, worked on this Nativity between 1470 and 1475. His roots in the Flemish tradition, combined with his knowledge of Italian art, give the work a balance between detailed realism and Renaissance perspective. The Child, the Virgin, and Saint Joseph are presented with serene dignity, while a realistic landscape opens up in the distance, illuminated by a clear, sharp light. Antonello's meticulousness is evident in the treatment of the clothing, the facial expressions, and the subtle chromatic nuances. The painter achieves an atmosphere in which divinity is hinted at through the delicate harmony between the figures and the environment, without resorting to dramatic effects. This nativity balances the technical precision of Northern Europe with the Italian search for order and beauty. The result is a calm, reflective scene in which the sacred emerges from the perfect conjunction of nature, humanity, and faith. Antonello da Messina thus leaves an eloquent testimony of how painting can be a bridge between different traditions, capable of enriching Christian iconography with new visions and technical resources. Number 31. The Adoration of the Magi, Paolo Uccello, between 1435 and 1440. Paolo Uccello, known for his passion for perspective and geometric forms, painted this Adoration of the Magi between 1435 and 1440, incorporating his fascination with order and visual structure. The scene, set in a schematic architectural and landscape setting, presents the Magi with their retinues, arranged in a balanced composition, full of anecdotal details and exotic animals. Although the figures maintain a certain hieraticism, Uccello seeks to give spatial coherence to the whole, applying his studies on linear perspective. The rich and contrasting colors enhance the liveliness of the clothing and the variety of the physiognomies. Unlike later naturalism, this Florentine painter still retains echoes of the International Gothic, with its refined lines and decorative elegance. Uccello's work is an example of the transition towards the scientific Renaissance, where the representation of space and the search for compositional harmony become priorities. This Adoration of the Magi is a valuable testimony to the intellectual and creative effort of the time, in which religious devotion is combined with the desire to understand and visually organize the world. Number 30. The Adoration of the Shepherds, Martin Schongauer, circa 1480. Martin Schongauer, a 15th-century German engraver and painter, composed this Adoration of the Shepherds around 1480, reflecting the heritage of late Gothic and the growing interest in realism in Northern Europe. The scene presents the Holy Family in a simple, rustic setting, with the shepherds bowing before the child. The attention to detail, the precision in the clothing, and the delicate rendering of animals and flowers show the artist's thoroughness. Despite the apparent simplicity, Schongauer organizes the composition with care, using color and line to direct the viewer's gaze toward the luminous center of the scene. The faces, serene and concentrated, convey a contained and sincere emotion. The influence of graphics is evident in the meticulous drawing and linear quality, which translates into a balanced chromaticism and a soft texture. This adoration, close to the devotional spirit of Northern Europe, combines the spiritual depth of the episode with a careful observation of the everyday world. Schongauer thus manages to humanize the biblical story without losing the sacred essence of the event. The work is an example of Germanic sensitivity, which finds in detail and intimacy the way to express the grandeur of the Christmas mystery. Number 29. The Adoration of the Magi. Albrecht Dürer, 1504. Albrecht Dürer, one of the most outstanding figures of the Nordic Renaissance, made The Adoration of the Magi in 1504, combining his mastery of engraving and drawing with oil painting. The scene, rendered with remarkable precision, shows the Holy Family in the midst of a luminous landscape, where the three wise men, in sumptuous attire and with individualized faces, offer their gifts to the child. Dürer, fascinated by humanism and the artistic advances of Italy, fuses Flemish meticulousness with the Renaissance interest in anatomy, perspective, and natural light. The balanced and symmetrical composition presents a well-calculated perspective, visible in the ruined architecture that frames the scene and in the horizon that opens with mountains and vegetation. The chromatic palette, rich but controlled, and the detail of the textures, from the fabrics to the stones, reflect Dürer's virtuosity. Although the work focuses on the biblical event, its realism and study of the natural environment bring the sacred story closer to human experience, inviting the viewer to contemplate the divine mystery wrapped in the harmony of the created world. The German painter thus achieves a masterful synthesis between the tradition of Northern art, with its attention to detail and delicacy in the observation of nature, and the Italian principles of the Renaissance, which provide order, proportion, and visual clarity. This adoration is testimony to Dürer's greatness as a cultural bridge between different artistic currents, achieving a refined expression of Christian spirituality through earthly beauty. Number 28. The Adoration of the Shepherds. Annibale Carracci, around 1600. Annibale Carracci, a key figure in the emergence of the Baroque, painted this Adoration of the Shepherds around 1600, introducing a renewal of pictorial language that seeks a return to simplicity and naturalism, far from mannerist complexities. In the scene, the Holy Family is presented with human closeness, while humble shepherds approach with timidity and amazement. The composition remains balanced, without falling into ornamental excesses, and the lighting, coming from the child, creates soft contrasts that give an intimate and devotional air. Carracci uses fluid brushstrokes, with soft modeling of the figures and a harmonious color palette that transmits warmth. The influence of Renaissance masters can be seen, but also the desire to give greater realism to the biblical narrative, humanizing the characters and their reactions. The absence of exaggerated theatricality and the natural integration of the landscape and the architecture in the background reinforce the verisimilitude of the scene. This adoration reflects the ideology of the Carracci Academy, which pursued natural beauty, compositional clarity, and simple expressiveness. The work seeks to move the viewer through the humanity of its protagonists and the close atmosphere, showing how the early Baroque knew how to balance devotion with emotional honesty and the calm contemplation of the religious mystery. Number 27. The Nativity. Federico Baracci, 1597. Federico Baracci, a master of chromatic sensitivity and delicate sfumato, painted his Nativity in 1597, offering a luminous and graceful version of the birth of Christ. The Holy Family appears in an intimate setting, with the Virgin leaning tenderly towards the child, while Saint Joseph discreetly assists. The light, coming from the infant himself, envelops the figures in a sacred halo, highlighting the gentle gestures, tender glances, and intertwined hands that reinforce the emotional bond of the scene. Baracci pays attention to detail. Delicate folds in the clothing, subtle chromatic nuances, and facial expressions full of devotion and tenderness. The loose and soft brushstrokes contribute to the ethereal atmosphere, while the oval composition, without rigidity, facilitates a harmonious flow of the gaze. The background landscape is hinted at without stealing the limelight, in a perfect measure. The work synthesizes the delicate balance between the human and the divine, presenting the Holy Family as a model of love and devotion. Baracci, influenced by mannerism but with pre-Baroque features, manages to transmit a deep emotion without falling into drama. This Nativity has been valued as an example of the artist's technical mastery and his ability to transform a biblical scene into an intimate and contemplative moment of serene spirituality. Number 26. The Annunciation with Saint Amedeo. Carlo Crivelli, 1486. In 1486, Carlo Crivelli created the Annunciation with Saint Amedeo, a work where the late Gothic style merges with the peculiar chromaticism and detail of the Venetian author. The scene of the Annunciation is set in a meticulously described urban environment, a palace with columns, marble floors, and a landscape that unfolds in the background. The Virgin Mary sits with a surprised expression while the angel Gabriel, suspended in an air filled with fruit and ornaments, announces the mystery. The presence of Bishop Saint Amedeo, patron of the city, highlights the link of the work with the civic and religious context. Crivelli uses bright, golden, and contrasting colors, with a clear line and luxurious ornamentation. Each object, fruit, flowers, architecture, is treated with miniaturist care. This attention to detail gives the scene an air of unreality and visual richness. The light is flat, without a marked chiaroscuro, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. The work, commissioned for the city of Ascoli Piceno, combines sacred narrative with civic pride, reflecting the relationship between faith and local identity. Crivelli, with his peculiar style, unites the Byzantine tradition of the use of gold leaf and the linear rigor of the Gothic with the increasing attention to naturalism, giving rise to a unique Annunciation, full of symbolism and refinement. Number 25. The Adoration of the Shepherds. Nicolas Poussin, 1633. Nicolas Poussin, an exponent of French classicism based in Rome, approaches the Christmas theme from a serene and orderly perspective in The Adoration of the Shepherds, 1633. The scene shows the Holy Family surrounded by shepherds and angels, but without excessive emotion or theatricality. Poussin organizes the figures in carefully calculated planes, ensuring compositional clarity. The light, clear and balanced, floods the space without strong contrasts, giving the scene a rational harmony. The French painter seeks ideal beauty, decorum, and balance, principles learned from classical art and the works of the great masters of the High Renaissance. The faces show contained expressions, the gestures are measured, and the arrangement of the figures forms a unitary whole. The coloring is sober, preferably in warm and neutral tones, so as not to disturb the general serenity. In this adoration, Poussin achieves an intellectual translation of the sacred narrative, appealing to reason and internal order rather than to direct emotion. The work is an example of his tendency towards formal perfection and serene contemplation of the religious mystery, in which spirituality is expressed through balance and moderation. Number 24. The Adoration of the Christ Child. Filippino Lippi. Nearby between 1485 and 1490. Filippino Lippi, son of Fra Filippo Lippi and disciple of Sandro Botticelli, painted the Adoration of the Christ Child with the grace and delicacy of the Florentine Quattrocento around 1485 to 90. The Holy Family is depicted in a bucolic setting, accompanied by angels and figures contemplating the child with reverence. The soft lines, defined contours, and serene expressions evoke the refined ideal of beauty of the period. The chromatic palette, bright and clear, uses blues, pinks, and soft greens, creating a harmonious atmosphere. The brushwork is delicate, emphasizing the soft modeling of the faces and the texture of the fabrics. Filippino includes subtle symbolic details, integrating nature into the sacred story, reinforcing the idea that divinity is also manifested in the harmony of the environment. This adoration reflects the transition between Botticelli's refined lyricism and the growing concern for naturalism that would mark the High Renaissance. Filippino Lippi, with his talent for balanced composition and elegant strokes, conveys in this work the calm, devotion, and human warmth of the Christmas event, enhancing its spiritual dimension with an idealized and intimate beauty. Number 23. The Nativity at Night. Geertgen tot St. Jan's. Nearby between 1480 and 1485. Geertgen tot St. Jan's, a painter from the 15th century Dutch school, composed his Nativity at Night around 1480 to 85, where the scene is illuminated almost exclusively by the light emanating from the Christ child. This device, later spread by other masters, creates an intimate and almost supernatural atmosphere. The Virgin, Saint Joseph, and the angels lean over the child, whose features are barely perceptible in the soft darkness. The artist's Nordic sensitivity is reflected in the attention to detail and the care taken with the textures, from the moss on the ground to the delicacy of the angelic wings. The composition is simple, with few figures, reinforcing the atmosphere of contemplation. The color palette is dark, but the contrast with the child's glow makes the shapes and faces stand out with a mystical intensity. Geertgen tot St. Jan's, influenced by the devotional tradition of Northern Europe, dispenses with superfluous ornamentation, concentrating on the emotional aspect and the spiritual force of the event. This nativity thus becomes a visual meditation on humility and miracle, where divine light stands out as the true protagonist. The work anticipates the interest in interior illumination that would develop in the Baroque, and demonstrates the capacity of Northern art to transmit spirituality through intimate realism and the poetic play of light and darkness. Number 22. The Adoration of the Shepherds. Jacopo Bassano. Nearby between 1548 and 1550. Jacopo Bassano, a 16th century Venetian master, painted his Adoration of the Shepherds between 1548 and 1550, imbuing it with the pastoral and naturalistic spirit that characterizes his style. The scene, set in a rustic stable, reveals the artist's fascination with color, light, and the details of country life. The shepherds appear in simple clothing and with marked features, surrounded by animals and farming tools. The infant Jesus, soft and luminous, is the focus of everyone's attention, creating an atmosphere of sincere tenderness. Bassano adopts a vibrant color palette with blues, greens, and ochres that give dynamism to the composition. Loose brushstrokes and diffuse lighting give texture and vitality to the scene. The painter rejects any pretense of grandiloquence, emphasizing the humanity of the sacred event, integrating the divine with the simplicity of everyday life. This adoration is an example of Bassano's interest in everyday realism and the connection with nature. Through the chromatic harmony and warmth of the scene, the artist makes the biblical story a close experience, in which divinity is revealed discreetly in the midst of country life, underlining the idea of a God who makes himself present in the most humble and familiar. Number 21. The Adoration of the Magi. Hieronymus Bosch. Nearby between 1475 and 1500. Hieronymus Bosch's Adoration of the Magi, painted between 1475 and 1500, stands out for its symbolic and enigmatic interpretation of the biblical story. The central scene shows the three wise men offering their gifts to the child, while the Virgin and Saint Joseph observe serenely. However, in the background and on the margins there is a repertoire of strange figures and details, full of cryptic meaning and secondary scenes that may allude to the corruption of the world, heresy or spiritual temptations. Bosch's characteristic style, with its earthy colors, precise brushstrokes and desire for the fantastic, is reflected in the complexity of the composition. The ruined architecture, the extravagant characters and the mixture of the divine with the grotesque generate a contrast that encourages reflection. This adoration is not just an illustration of the biblical episode, but an invitation to decipher a moral universe, where the purity of the Nativity faces the distortions of the earthly world. Bosch combines Flemish tradition in detail with an overflowing imagination, using Christian iconography to explore the human condition. The result is a rich and fascinating work, open to multiple interpretations, which makes the Adoration of the Magi a journey to the heart of spirituality and the moral challenges of its time. Number 20. The Adoration of the Child. Lorenzo Lotto, 1523. Lorenzo Lotto, a 16th-century Venetian painter, tackles the Adoration of the Child in 1523 with an intimate sensitivity that distinguishes his work from the splendor of other Italian masters. The scene is reserved. The child Jesus lies on the ground, illuminating with his presence the devout expressions of Mary, Joseph, and a few angels and shepherds. The warm, soft light enhances the emotional dimension, while the surrounding nature is delicately hinted at. Lotto employs a harmonious palette of greens, ochres, and soft blues, using perspective to guide the gaze towards the central figure of the child. The expressions of the characters, marked by a gentle tenderness, reflect human empathy before the divine mystery. The composition does not focus on grandeur, but on contemplation and the inner experience of the sacred event. This adoration embodies Lotto's ability to create contemplative and profound atmospheres, without resorting to stage artifice. By opting for simplicity and emotional elegance, the Venetian painter conveys a reflection on the humility and closeness of the divine, inviting the viewer to silently participate in the wonder of Christmas. Number 19. The Adoration of the Magi. Diego Velázquez, 1619. Diego Velázquez, during his Seville period, painted The Adoration of the Magi in 1619, an early work in which the technical skill and psychological depth that would mark his later production can already be seen. The painting presents the Holy Family surrounded by the Magi, who offer their gifts with thoughtful and restrained attitudes. Velázquez does not resort to pomp or monumental splendor. Instead, the characters are shown close, with individualized faces and an austere atmosphere, which highlights the human dimension of the sacred event. The composition is balanced and sober, with the central figure of the child Jesus radiating a soft light that marks delicate contrasts of chiaroscuro. The chromatic palette, dominated by ochres, earth tones, and some touches of red and blue, gives the scene an intimate air. The painter, attentive to truth, represents the textures of the clothing, the physiognomic features, and the sincere expressions, transmitting the humility of the Christmas mystery. This work is part of the incipient Baroque in Spain, but Velázquez avoids extreme drama or artifice. Instead, he opts for an honest approach to the biblical story, focusing on the contained emotions and the subtlety of the moment. This Adoration of the Magi anticipates the future mastery of the painter, for whom the faithful observation of reality would be a vehicle for spiritual depth. Number 18. The Nativity, Piero della Francesca, between 1470 and 1475. Piero della Francesca, one of the most notable masters of the Italian Quattrocento, painted his Nativity between 1470 and 1475, reflecting his obsession with geometry, harmony, and light. The scene presents the Virgin, Saint Joseph, the Child, and some shepherds in a sober setting, where the figures are situated in a simplified architecture or space. Piero uses an exact perspective and clear, diaphanous lighting, creating a serene balance between the forms and the atmosphere. The color palette is subtle, with a preference for soft, gray, and earthy tones, without great stridency. In this setting, the figures acquire an almost sculptural presence, with calm faces and restrained poses. The absence of excessive drama and the simplicity of the gestures highlight the significance of the moment, manifested through visual harmony and calm. In Piero della Francesca's Nativity, the divine event merges with Renaissance reason and order, underlining the idea of a balanced cosmos where the sacred is revealed in formal perfection. The work embodies the fusion between faith and visual science, integrating the spirituality of the biblical story with the intellectual search for ideal beauty. Number 17. The Adoration of the Shepherds, Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, 1650. Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, a prominent painter of the Sevillian Baroque, tackles the Adoration of the Shepherds around 1650 with a pictorial language full of sweetness and affection. The scene presents the Holy Family surrounded by shepherds who admire the child Jesus with sincere expressions and kind smiles. The artist uses a warm light, which seems to emanate from the child, and creates an enveloping atmosphere, where the figures communicate with delicate glances and gestures. The soft brushstrokes and the harmonious chromatic range, with a predominance of golden, pink, and blue tones, give the work an emotional warmth. The chiaroscuro does not seek excessive drama, but rather highlights the contrast between the humility of the stable and the divine luminosity of the scene. Murillo concentrates on the tenderness of the moment, presenting a close, humanized, and devout nativity. This interpretation of the Christmas story is framed within the Catholic spirituality of the Spanish Golden Age, in which the pathos is softened, bringing the miracle closer to everyday experience. Murillo translates faith into comforting images, designed to move the viewer and guide him towards pious contemplation through the simplicity of family love. Number 16. The Newborn, Georges de la Tour, circa 1645. The Newborn, by Georges de la Tour, painted around 1645, does not exactly represent a traditional nativity, but has often been interpreted as an allusion to the birth of Christ. The scene shows a newborn wrapped in cloths, held by two women, possibly the mother and a nurse, illuminated only by a candle. This source of light caresses the hands, the fabrics, and the faces, creating an intimate and silent atmosphere. De la Tour, an artist of the French Baroque, was a master in the use of chiaroscuro, inheriting the Caravagist influence, but filtering it through a refined sense of geometry and calm. Here, the compositional sobriety, the absence of superfluous elements and the serenity of the gestures allude to the transcendence of the moment of birth, whether human or divine. The painter succeeds in evoking the tenderness and mystery surrounding the newborn, placing it in a timeless space. The work thus becomes a sacred metaphor. The candlelight is the same inner light that illuminates the miracle of life. This domestic and silent scene invites contemplation, reminding us that the divine can manifest itself in the simplicity of an instant illuminated by human warmth and closeness. Number 15. The Annunciation. Simone Martini, 1333. Simone Martini, a key figure in Italian Gothic, painted the Annunciation in 1333, together with Lippo Memma, for the Cathedral of Siena. This panel is one of the landmarks of the International Gothic style, with its elegant strokes, refined lines, and generous use of gold leaf. The scene shows the Virgin surprised by the angel Gabriel, who announces the Incarnation. The tension of the moment is perceived in Mary's gesture and the fluid movement of the angel's garments, while the words of the angelic greeting float inscribed like filigree. The decorative richness, the meticulous detail, and the gold background create an unreal and sacred atmosphere. Martini uses vivid colors, intense reds, greens, and blues, and finishes the scene with delicate floral motifs. The facial expressions are subtle and contemplative, giving the characters a calm spirituality. The miniature Gothic architecture, inscriptions, and small symbolic details reinforce the sacredness of the story. This Annunciation sums up the elegance of the Gothic, inviting devotion and wonder at the mystery. Linear beauty, ornamental richness, and technical exquisiteness are at the service of the biblical narrative, creating an image that combines solemnity, visual poetry, and aristocratic refinement. Number 14. The Adoration of the Magi. Peter Bruegel the Elder, 1564. In 1564, Peter Bruegel the Elder, famous for his rural scenes and his penetrating vision of the human condition, tackles the theme of the Adoration of the Magi in his own particular style. The Holy Family appears surrounded by a crowd of curious faces, peasants and soldiers, in a wintry and gloomy setting that contrasts with the usual majestic atmosphere of this episode. Bruegel humanizes the scene, distancing it from courtly splendor, and places the miracle in the midst of a hostile and earthly environment. The color palette, dominated by browns, grays, and dull greens, reflects the Nordic temperament and the realism characteristic of the painter. The figures, represented with firm strokes, rough faces, and everyday attitudes, de-emphasize the pomp and highlight the contrast between the humility of the Holy Family and the indifference or somewhat crude curiosity of the crowd. Bruegel uses the Adoration to reflect on humanity. In the midst of the bustle and misery, a sacred event occurs that goes almost unnoticed. This interpretation opens a moral and philosophical perspective, reminding us that divinity can be found in unexpected places and that the real world rarely conforms to pious idealizations. Number 13. The Adoration of the Shepherds. Hugo van der Goes. Around 1475. Around 1475, Hugo van der Goes, a 15th century Flemish painter, painted an Adoration of the Shepherds that combines technical refinement with intense psychological depth. The scene takes place in a dark space, illuminated by the light emanating from the Christ child, whose soft features are reflected in the intense faces of Mary, Joseph, and the shepherds. Van der Goes, skilled in oil painting, reproduces in detail the textures of the fabrics, the shine of the jewels, and the naturalness of the expressions. The balanced and dense composition benefits from a subtle chiaroscuro that creates an intimate and contemplative atmosphere. Unlike other Flemish works, where attention to detail can disperse the gaze, here the devotional focus is clearly marked, drawing emotion towards the child. The rich and deep color palette contributes to the mysticism of the scene. This work reflects the ability of Flemish art to combine descriptive precision with spiritual introspection. Van der Goes manages to convey the significance of the moment through a secluded atmosphere, reminding us that the Nativity is not only a historical event, but also a mystery that moves the soul. Number 12. The Adoration of the Shepherds. Andrea Mantegna, circa 1450. Andrea Mantegna, a representative of the Italian Quattrocento, painted The Adoration of the Shepherds around 1450 with a marked influence from classical sculpture and scientific perspective. The scene presents a stony, almost arid landscape, where Mary, Joseph, and the child are placed in the foreground, while the shepherds come in amazement. Mantegna shows a precise stroke, sculpted figures in his modeling, and a masterful use of perspective, placing the biblical event in a believable environment. The colors, sober and earthy, give the whole a solemn air, without falling into excessive ornamentation. The light is clear and the shapes are clearly outlined, reflecting the humanist effort to understand nature and space. Despite the emotional restraint, the work manages to convey reverence and respect for the divine fact, based on formal solidity and visual integrity. With this adoration, Mantegna lays the foundations of a Renaissance language where geometry, observation of the world, and precision of drawing are integrated with sacred iconography, creating a balance between earthly experience and religious transcendence. Number 11. The Nativity. Correggio, 1528. Correggio, a master of the Italian High Renaissance, creates his Nativity in 1528, also known as The Night, a canvas famous for its revolutionary use of light. Here, the light comes from the child Jesus, illuminating the faces of Mary, Joseph, the shepherds, and the angels who look down from above. This highly dramatic lighting effect immerses the scene in a magical and ethereal atmosphere, fusing the incipient Baroque with the sweetness of the Renaissance. The composition is dynamic. The figures are grouped around the child in a circular arrangement, creating a central focus of attention. Correggio plays with contrasts, highlighting expressions of wonder and devotion. The draperies acquire a subtle texture and the anatomies are softly modeled. The soft and harmonious coloring intensifies the intimate and affectionate character of the representation. This nativity marks a milestone in the history of religious painting by depicting the miracle of the Incarnation through the inner light of the child, a resource that will influence many later artists. Correggio thus achieves an image charged with emotion, where spirituality materializes in a radiant and enveloping atmosphere. Number 10. The Adoration of the Shepherds. Giorgione, around 1500. Giorgione, one of the initiators of the 16th century Venetian school, painted around 1500 his Adoration of the Shepherds, also known as the Allendale Nativity. The painting displays the distinctive characteristics of the Venetian style, the subtle use of light, the harmonious integration of the landscape, and the search for a poetic atmosphere. The Holy Family is set in a natural setting, with gentle hills, trees, and a serene sky, while the shepherds bow in silent respect. The painter uses a delicate brushstroke and blends the contours, creating a fluid transition between the figures and the background. The color palette is rich in nuances, with greens, blues, and browns evoking a lyrical atmosphere. Giorgione does not focus on narrative anecdote, but on silent emotion, on the suggestion of divine presence through chromatic harmony and the soft diffusion of light. This adoration, devoid of superfluous ornamentation, stands out for its lyricism and its emphasis on contemplation. The formal simplicity and profound visual musicality make the canvas a paradigmatic example of Venetian sensibility, which understood the sacred act as an intimate dialogue between nature, spirit, and light. Number 9. The Adoration of the Shepherds. Domenico Ghirlandaio, 1485. Domenico Ghirlandaio, a Florentine master of the Quattrocento, painted around 1485 the Adoration of the Shepherds for the high altar of the Sassetti Chapel in the Church of Santa Trinita, Florence. This work integrates Christian tradition with the aesthetic refinement of the Renaissance. The composition focuses on the Holy Family, with the child Jesus placed on the ground, while the Virgin and Saint Joseph contemplate him with serene adoration. Around them, the shepherds approach with humility, displaying honest expressions and simple devotion. Ghirlandaio stands out for his ability to combine compositional rigor, solidity of figures, and detail in the vestments, fusing naturalism with the linear sensibility characteristic of his time. The open and bright background landscape frames the figures and places them in a harmonious setting, underlining the religious message with earthly beauty. The clear and uniform light gives the scene an atmosphere of serenity, avoiding drama and highlighting the human nobility of the characters. Through precision in drawing, balanced composition, and soft coloring, Ghirlandaio elevates a biblical episode to an aesthetic and spiritual experience at the same time. The result is a work that invites contemplation, reflecting the Renaissance ideal that divine truth can be expressed through harmony, measure, and order of representation. Number 8. The Adoration of the Magi. Gentile da Fabriano, 1423. The Adoration of the Magi, that Gentile da Fabriano painted in 1423 for the Strozzi family, is one of the most emblematic works of the International Gothic style in Florence. The panel, richly decorated with gold leaf, shows the procession of the Magi towards the child Jesus, surrounded by a multitude of characters, animals, and exquisite details. The scene is a display of luxury, color, and refinement, with sumptuous clothing, elegant expressions, and a festive atmosphere. Gentile stands out for his meticulousness and the fineness of his line. Each figure is drawn with care, each texture is clearly seen. The light radiates from the golden background, unifying the whole in an unreal and sacred atmosphere. In addition, the succession of narrative scenes, such as the miniature landscapes in the background, contribute to a continuous reading of the gospel story. This adoration transcends the literality of the biblical event, showing it as a courtly and sublime event. The work synthesizes the transition between the medieval world, with its taste for ornamentation and preciosity, and the new Renaissance sensibility, which would soon seek greater realism. The sumptuousness of the ensemble does not impede devotion. Through material splendor, Gentile da Fabriano celebrates the divine miracle, making adoration a dazzling visual experience. Number 7. The Nativity. Giotto. Close between 1303 and 1305. The Nativity that Giotto included in the cycle of frescoes in the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua around 1303–05 was a milestone in Western art. Giotto breaks with the conventions of the Byzantine and earlier Gothic styles, showing a coherent space, figures with volume and a natural interaction between the characters. In the scene, the Virgin leans tenderly over the child, while Saint Joseph, pensive, stands to one side. The angels and the shepherds participate with sober gestures, revealing contained human emotions. The fresco painting, with soft colors and the almost total elimination of the gold background, brings the sacred event closer to the viewer. Giotto uses light and shadow to model the volumes, giving the figures a three-dimensional presence. The stable, small and stable, reinforces the credibility of the story, while the sparse landscape helps to focus attention on the intimacy of the moment. This nativity marks the beginning of the path towards the Renaissance. Giotto humanizes the scene, giving it a psychological and emotional dimension never seen before. Through his formal innovation, the painter makes the biblical story a close, accessible, and profound event. Number 6. The Annunciation, Fra Angelico, between 1437 and 1446. Fra Angelico painted several Annunciations, but the most famous is the one that decorates one of the corridors of the convent of San Marco in Florence, made between 1437 and 1446. In this work, the Virgin Mary and the angel Gabriel meet in a serene cloister, bathed in a clear light. The columns and arches, represented with a coherent perspective, frame the divine event, integrating the architectural space with the sacred scene. The delicate and clean chromatic palette reinforces the spiritual atmosphere, while the expressions of Mary and Gabriel exude humility, reverence, and peace. Fra Angelico moves away from narrative complexity. There are no superfluous elements, the gesture is minimal, and silence seems to envelop the figures. Each line is clear, each form is perfectly harmonized. This Annunciation reflects the fusion between religious devotion and the intellectual rigor of the nascent Renaissance. Fra Angelico uses Renaissance perspective and clarity, but without losing the contemplative spirituality of Gothic art. The result is an image that invites prayer, emphasizing the purity and mystery of the moment when the divine bursts into earthly life. Number 5. The Adoration of the Magi, Peter Paul Rubens, between 1609 and 1610. Peter Paul Rubens, a Flemish Baroque painter, interpreted the Adoration of the Magi between 1609 and 1610 in a dynamic, opulent, and theatrical style. The scene is populated by characters, the three wise men with their rich clothing, their pages and entourages, and the Holy Family in the middle of a crowd. Rubens employs a complex composition in which diagonals and curved lines generate constant movement, underlined by vibrant light that highlights deep reds, golds, and blues. Unlike the serene interpretations of the Renaissance, Rubens chooses exuberance, broad gestures, and overwhelming emotion. The faces show wonder, admiration, and joy, while the Christ child, the focus of the event, is illuminated with a supernatural glow. The loose and energetic brushstrokes contribute to the feeling of vitality. This Baroque approach seeks to impact the viewer, to move him and immerse him in the scene. Rubens' Adoration is not only an act of faith, but also a grandiose spectacle where the sacred and the human come together in a chromatic feast and a majestic staging. Number 4. The Adoration of the Shepherds, El Greco, between 1612 and 1614. Towards the end of his life, between 1612 and 1614, El Greco painted the Adoration of the Shepherds for his own tomb in the convent of Santo Domingo del Antiguo in Toledo. This work condenses his mature style, elongated figures, vibrant colors and expressive lighting effects. In the scene, the Holy Family and the shepherds gather around the child, whose light illuminates their faces, generating dramatic contrasts between light and dark. El Greco emphasizes the verticality of the compositions, with ascending gestures and a sense of spiritual dynamism. The intense colors, deep blues, bright reds, luminous yellows, produce a mystical atmosphere. The loose, impasto brushstrokes reinforce the visionary character of the image, distancing it from strict naturalism. Here, the Nativity is not an everyday occurrence, but a transcendent event that connects the earthly with the divine. This adoration exemplifies the originality of El Greco, who combines his Byzantine heritage, the influence of mannerism and Counter-Reformation spirituality. The work invites inner contemplation and the elevation of the spirit, highlighting the mystical dimension of the birth of Christ. Number 3. The Adoration of the Shepherds. Caravaggio, 1609. Caravaggio, a master of chiaroscuro, painted The Adoration of the Shepherds in 1609, probably during his stay in Messina. The scene, stripped of any idealization, places the Holy Family in a humble and dark environment, where the focal light falls on the child, illuminating the weathered faces and simple clothing of the shepherds. Caravaggio rejects divine rhetoric and presents the birth as a real, tangible event, in which the figures seem taken from everyday life. The arrangement is sober and direct: Mary, exhausted and pensive, Saint Joseph old, and the shepherds rough and silent. The powerful light models the bodies with volume and realism, while suggesting the spiritual dimension of the moment. The chiaroscuro underlines the tension between the darkness of the world and the clarity provided by the child. This adoration is an example of the Caravaggist style: emotional, dramatic, and sincere. Caravaggio makes the miracle accessible, showing it in its rawness and humanity. Devotion is expressed in the silence, humility, and closeness of the figures, inviting us to feel the intensity of faith through sensory experience. Number 2. The Adoration of the Magi. Sandro Botticelli, between 1475 and 1476. Sandro Botticelli painted a famous Adoration of the Magi in 1475–76, commissioned by the Medici family. This work places the Gospel scene in a Florentine setting, with classical ruins and a group of contemporary figures. Among the attendees, portraits of members of the Medici family, intellectuals, and illustrious figures of the time can be seen. The Holy Family occupies the center, while a rich human tapestry unfolds around it. Botticelli employs an elegant line, precise contours, and a clear color palette, reflecting the refinement of the Florentine Quattrocento. The light is soft, subtly highlighting the faces and clothing. The scene takes on a political and cultural significance. The Medici appear as guarantors of order, piety, and the artistic splendor of the city. The adoration thus becomes an aesthetic and symbolic spectacle, fusing Christian spirituality with the earthly grandeur of Florence. The work integrates devotion, portraiture, and the vindication of civic power, anticipating the influence that Botticelli would exert on later art. In this way, the adoration is elevated to the category of a historical, cultural, and religious event, uniting the sacred past with the humanist present. Number 1. The Adoration of the Magi. Leonardo da Vinci, between 1481 and 1482. In 1481–82, Leonardo da Vinci began his Adoration of the Magi, a painting that remained unfinished but represents a crucial point in his artistic evolution. The work shows the Virgin and Child in the center, surrounded by the Magi, horses, moving figures, and ruined architecture in the background. Although the painting is still in its sketch state, the complex composition and dynamism of the lines that converge toward the central axis can be appreciated, giving the scene an organic movement. Leonardo investigates aerial perspective and light gradation, generating an ethereal atmosphere where the figures merge with the environment. His interest in anatomy and psychological expression can be seen in the gestures and postures of the characters, who seem to engage in emotional dialogue. The lack of finishing allows us to see Leonardo's creative process, the use of strokes to define volumes and attitudes, and his constant search for harmony. This adoration embodies the transition to the High Renaissance, pointing the way towards a more complex representation of reality, where the divine and the human intertwine in a space marked by doubt, discovery, and visual research. Leonardo's unfinished work continues to fascinate with its latent potential and the audacity of its conception. Thank you for watching our video. Subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. Give it a like, comment your thoughts, and share this video with your friends and family.